Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights, and welcome to part 2 of our conversation here with Rabbi Irving Yitz Greenberg, theologian, activist, thinker, and most recently the author of this book, The Triumph of Life, which I encourage you to pick up if you have not already. Rav Yitz, in our first section, we spoke about life. It's called The Triumph of Life. We spoke about life, that Judaism is a religion about life. We went over the idea that each human is created as unique and equal and of infinite value, and the different ways that trickles through how we live in society, not just in ritual law, but the way we carry ourselves, the way we interact with others. Every moment of our lives, we should be thinking about choosing life, choosing blessing, increasing the quality of life in the world. This time I want to focus on the triumph part of this. You know, what does triumph mean, and the methodology to get to triumph. And I guess I'll open with, just so, if we're going to say that the goal of Judaism is about being pro-life, and not in the typical framing, but you understand what I mean, being pro-life, and our goal is triumph of life. What does the triumph of life look like? What's the goal? How do we win when it comes to Judaism?
Thanks for the question, triumph. Surprisingly, there's a pretty clear and almost concrete portrait of what a triumph would look like. I should start by saying that one of the main ideas of the book is that Judaism is the religion of tikkun olam, meaning you're going to so improve the world, repair it, that in the end life's going to win out. And what is triumph? This is the messianic vision in Jewish tradition. All the enemies of life will be overcome, meaning poverty. It's a real enemy. It undercuts life, education, hunger, oppression, all forms of discrimination and sexism and racism and anti-Semitism. Overcoming war will beat the sword into plowshares, which was taken over by the UN building. And sickness. So the prophets talk about, Isaiah speaks about the day will come when the blind will see, and the deaf will hear, and the lame will dance. So the triumph of life, if you think about Jewish tradition, they mean it all the way. All the enemies are defeated. And when I worked into it, it struck me, I hadn't thought seriously enough about it. The ultimate vision, at least in Isaiah, is overcoming death, literally. Whereas this religion believes not only that you should choose life, and life will win, it really believes, or at least some of its prophets do, that in the end, the triumph will be that we'll literally overcome death. Now, when I got through writing that down, I had a little reaction myself. This is over the top, jumping the shark.
Yeah.
Overcoming death. I mean, Leon Kass, a bioethicist who I greatly respect, once wrote that the idea of overcoming death, it's humans revolting against being human. I mean, one of the best things about human is that they have a limit. After all, if you die, it also means that Hitler dies, that the evil people also don't live forever.
Right.
So he kind of objected to that thought. So when reacting to that, I said to myself, well, I'll make you a second offer. I'm still fascinated by the first offer. I mean, how bold and how visionary.
The first offer is the idea that we'll live forever, moving forward.
Defeat all the enemies of life. Incredible.
We'll get to a point in history where those who are alive on this planet are living forever.
Okay. That's in itself pretty.
That's version
bold.
1. That's triumph number 1.
Now, to make a little more reasonable, so Isaiah in chapter 25, he says openly, we're going to swallow up death in eternity. In chapter 65, he's a little more reasonable.
Okay.
He says, how about we extend life considerably so that Nar ben Mea Shana Yamut, when the person dies 100 years old, they'll say, oh, he was just a kid. Just a kid. So that would be meaningful, and it's doubly meaningful because that's what's happened in the last 2 centuries. The average life expectancy of human beings, late 18th century, was in the upper 30s. The average life expectancy of human being on the planet in the 21st century is in the upper 70s. So I joke and sometimes say, if we can double the lifespan every 50 years or so, 100 years, how long will it take to live forever? But anyway, but the point is, think boldly. In fact, the ultimate boldness of the Jewish tradition, the rabbis think seriously about resurrection.
Right.
That the body itself, the dead body, not the spirit, will live on forever, but the dead body will be revived. The human being in all their flesh and blood and will be brought back. Now, even if it's not doable, I love it. When you think about it again, it's such
Right.
great. Again, for a profound truth, you know what the profound truth is? If you love somebody, if you've ever had the experience of somebody you loved and you lost, you realize, you know, the fact that they live on in the soul, in the future world, it helps, but it's not really a consolation. You really miss this person. Yes, this person who, with their flaws and with their sweat and smell, that's what you love, that whole body. So the vision of the rabbis that, as it were, that someday maybe if we ultimately triumphed, that we would overcome and we bring back not just the future, everybody would live forever, but bring back those we lost in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So even if, as I say to people, even if it's wrong, it's right. I mean, it's a measure of how boldly and how far we should think in terms of. So, secondly, there had been major steps in this direction. In other words, one of the great things about modern culture is that it raised the standard of living, public health, extended life. So these are not totally pipe dreams.
Mm-hmm.
These are realistic possibilities, or at least extending life is, and that's what Judaism is saying. And every profession, every person, every talent could make a contribution to this. So that's the triumph, at least we should be thinking about and working toward. That is balanced, as I said many times before. The balance is the realism of the tradition. If you're talking about life winning out, but you're starting in this world and you don't fool yourself, you see where life is losing or where life is held back, and build on that, improve from that on. So that's the second dimension. I think one of the great things of Jewish tradition is that it takes a utopian vision, making a world so perfect that every human being will be treated as equal, unique, infinitely valuable, making a perfect world so there'll be no more war or no more discrimination. That's quite a utopian vision. But to give it credit, it turns around and says to get there, you're going to have to be realistic, hard-boiled, particular, not universal. You're going to have to be personal, conservative in a small c, namely one step at a time. If you want to have everyone being totally free, absolutely the dream. Men and women, it says in the Torah, not just image of God, man, but men and women, absolutely. But when Judaism started, slavery was rampant. It was taken for granted. The tradition did not abolish slavery overnight. Why didn't it do it? Because look at America's experience Civil War. When they thought they were trying to abolish it overnight, it led to a major war, more wounded, more casualties, more death than ever before in American history. So the tradition says, start slavery and reduce it, limit it. If you look at the Torah, chapter 20 of Exodus, start by putting a limit of 6 years. Start by putting a limit during the 6 years of 6 days a week. And on the seventh day, at Shabbat, the slave is free. And step by step, the rabbis come along and add and build on that. You can't give a slave servile labor while he's in your control. You can't give a slave lower quality food, lower quality shelter, lower quality clothes. In other words, you have to treat the servitude with the same dignity and same value as free. So step by step they moved from a world in which people were simply commodities to be bought and sold and used up and thrown away, to a world as we are now dreaming, where everybody is free and slavery is gone. So that combination of realistic method, which again can't be accomplished in one generation, that's part of the greatness again of Jewish tradition. To perfect the world can happen in one lifetime. So the secret is, you push it as far as you can. You take 1 step, 5 steps, as far as it can go in your lifetime. But before you quit, before you're gone, raise a child, raise a student, raise a community that takes up these values, and they will move it the next level and the next level. And if you try 100% overnight, you'll get a civil war, and you'll get backlash, and you'll get communism and Maoism that destroyed millions of people because they didn't want to change fast enough. But if you do 1% a year for 100 years, you'll get 100%. So again, that was the rabbi's greatness, to see that the covenantal method is one step at a time. Incrementalism, you give up, and it's important to give it up, the coercion, the right to force, to beat, to do what the Russians did, put them in concentration camps, to silence them and put them in jail and kill them. You give that up, no coercion. Respect for human beings means you have to persuade them. You have to educate them.
Great, so let me summarize and ask. So first is, I asked kind of what does triumph look like, and you mentioned kind of it literally means overcoming death. That's the most utopian, idealistic version. The models you offered were, we get to a point where people live forever, we get to a point where people live much longer, right. Or we get to a point, a more extreme version, where people are able to come back from the dead, that it's not just about their souls, it's about their whole bodies coming back from the dead. I want to just, on that point alone, ask you one more follow-up, which is, as you know, I'm a student of Musar, you're a student of Musar. Most traditional, or a lot of, certainly Mesilat Yesharim, a lot of traditional Jewish Musar literature is about behaving a certain way in the world today because of what will happen in the world to come.
Right.
How does the world to come fit into that, to this, or is that a separate conversation, or how do you think about that?
So the honest answer is that the world to come is a little bit, not contradiction, but a little in tension with this idea. And I've, looking back, argue that the rabbis understood, because the Torah stresses very much everything in this world. It also promises a reward if you act properly. If you listen to God, it will rain. If you don't listen to God, it will be drought.
Rewards in this world.
The rewards in this world. The rabbis saw, number one, that's one of their great teachings, that God doesn't operate that way anyway. Just as God does not split the Red Sea and overcome natural law anymore, so God does not do that kind of guaranteed reward, and you don't, if you do a sin, a lightning bolt doesn't strike you. And so they try to say it's not that there's no reward or there's no place where there's true final justice for everybody, including the innocent. But that's the world to come. But in a way, the world to come is less central, and the idea of reward is less critical than it is in biblical time when it's immediate. They say about capital, if I give you $1 million now, it's worth $1 million. If I offer you $1 million 20 years from now, they depreciate. Mm-hmm. So in the same way the rabbis were trying to depreciate, or in the words of ethics of the fathers, do not be like servants who serve the master for the sake of reward. You should not be serving God for that reward. So the world to come is a reward, but it's a bonus, it's a secondary. And Rabbi Soloveitchik has a wonderful line in one of his books, Halachic Man. He points out that the 1 hour of, it's a quote in the Talmud, 1 hour of pleasure in the world to come is more pleasurable and more fulfilling than all the delights of this world. Mm-hmm. But 1 hour of good deeds and constructive living and making this a better world in this world is worth more than all the world to come. And I think that is I'm taking my stand on that, and that's a theme in Judaism. In the Middle Ages, it was played down. It was much less important. But in my mind, it's one of its greatest visions. This world, which is in such a bad shape and so many problems, you don't write it off and say there'll be pie in the sky, and the great by and by was a labor song of the early 20th century. No, you don't write off this world, and I'm arguing not only don't you write it off, we take up the Torah's vision of redeeming it completely. Mm-hmm. So yes, this is one of the main challenges, to take the body seriously, to take this life seriously, but in me it's also part of the enrichment and the depth of life. And Judaism is saying, as Rabbi Salenter again, if we quote our common hero, he said, it's as spiritually as challenging and as fulfilling to eat fully, properly, joyfully the day before Yom Kippur as it is to spiritually fast for 24 hours. Mm. And yes, in other words, to me, that's part of it. There's part of the religion and part of the fulfillment is to make love and not just religiously restrict certain days you can't have sexual relationships, but rather on the days when it's not only permitted, it's fulfilling. It is when you really make love as a image of God of infinite value to a second. That is the moment when one can have the deepest experience of God's presence. The Talmud says openly, when you make love properly, Shekhinah, the divine presence, is there. And yes, so what I'm saying is creativity, good food, good sex, good conversation, good actions, good deeds. This is the spiritual maestro quality that one can seek in seeking the triumph of life, or other more important, fulfilling life. And this is my argument in the book, that we're living in an age when God is most hidden, totally hidden maybe, but that means totally present. And we discover God when we go into the depth of life, because you don't see it in the visible, obvious kinds of ways. In the depth of life, that's where you have the deepest fulfillment in connection. That's where you have the most exciting, orgasmic experience of the physical of the person that you love. That's in the depth where you have the flavor of food or of life as never before. That's the opportunity in our time also.
Beautiful. So I have more to discuss on that, but I want to move us forward a little bit here. So you've referenced now a little bit the way slavery is evolving over time, the relationship to God in this era versus other eras. Can you lay it out a little bit, zoom out a little bit here, and talk about kind of the methodology for the triumph and the way you think about how time is unfolding?
So the methodology is, we have a vision of the final stage. I think Rabbi Kook was supposed to the one who said that historically people always said that ancient times, that was the great religious moment. And we look back, and of course it's a tendency. Christians say, well, Jesus at his lifetime, or Jews look back and say Moses or the Sinai. But Rav Kook said, no, this is a future-looking religion. The ultimate achievement, the final Exodus for the whole world, will be greater than the biblical Exodus. So we should look forward-looking. Forward-looking, I keep saying it, that's world repair. That's the Messianic age, when you overcome all the enemies of life, when you have the deepest fulfillment in life, when, again, so Isaiah, when the world, they will know no evil, no harm will be done anywhere on this earth, because the fear of God, the presence of God will be felt everywhere. So that's forward-looking. Now, how do you get there?
Yeah, great. So talk to me, start with Brit. Talk to me about the idea of, I know one of the methodologies you reference is the idea of covenant and the way it's evolved.
So the central, again, to me, it's one of the greatest of Jewish teaching, again. We've taught the world belief in God, but belief in God depends how you use it. Some people believe in God means it's like a cargo cult. Then I don't have to do anything. Then when the early Zionists started, the Haredim said, you can't do, they have to wait for the Messiah. Well, of course, nothing got done, and in fact, tragically enough, a lot of those Jews were left behind in Europe, where they were destroyed by the Nazis. So the answer is, covenant has this wonderful balance. On the one hand, you do have a presence of God. It's a partnership. You do have someone you're accountable to. One of the big problems of modern culture, with all the achievement and with God self-limiting, people could do a lot of things and they say, look, I'm the one who's doing these things. I'm the master of the universe. And what happened for the master universe? Abuse, global warming, climate crisis, environmental crisis. They lost that sense of partnership and accountability. Judaism says, so here's the best of both worlds. You know God is with you, you know God is guiding you, you know God is judging you, you know God is telling you to stand there, not be frightened, not be intimidated. But that does not release you from doing everything necessary. And your role then is to be active. What I'm arguing in the book is it's even more dramatic than that. In the first stage, because God loves us, God starts us off as children, does most of the heavy lifting, does most of the visible miracles, does most of the liberation from Egypt, because they were never slaves, they didn't want to go.
You're talking about kind of biblical era, 5 books of Moses.
Right.
God treats us like a child. That's the relationship between
and the
Jewish
Bible.
people.
And again, it's a loving child. God is a loving parent, looks out for us, fights our enemies, but most of the heavy work is done by God. And in the case of Egypt, they weren't ready to leave, so God sends Moses and 10 plagues to push them.
Mm-hmm.
But the rabbis say now God has self-limited again, meaning called the humans to take up more responsibility.
That's when? That's with temple destruction, before temple destruction?
Actually, the rabbis started before the temple destruction, but after the temple destruction, they won. They won the argument.
That's when it...
They won them. Why? Because...
Why'd they start before the temple destruction?
Because I think that was the next layer, and the next meaning. In other words, they were the ones who saw that God loves us and starts at our level, and as the Jews for 1,000 years had trained to live covenantally, had understood the relationship to God, grasped the vision of the future, you could now move into the next level. The next level was you take charge. When you want to know what God wants, God will not speak from heaven anymore. You want to know what God wants from you? Will not send a prophet magnificent. Micah says, what does God ask of you? To do justice, loving kindness, and walk humbly with God. It's magnificent. But now when you grow up, God says, do you want to know what I wanted from you? Use your brain. Now you'll study Micah, you'll study the other great prophets,
right, and
then you will apply your mind, your human judgment, and that's why I gave you these powers. I spoke of you being the image of God. Rabbi Soloveitchik points out it's not just dignity, it's godlike powers. We have mind that can understand. We have emotions that can love as greatly as God loves. Mm. So take these talents and apply them and use them, and that's the next step of partnership. Take more responsibility. If you look at the 2 temples, the first temple was destroyed because they didn't listen to God. They did idolatry. They betrayed the Torah. But if you look at the second temple, famous line, the rabbi said, it's not because they failed God, it's because of baseless hatred, meaning they had civil war. It was zealots who revolted against Rome irresponsibly. And again, if you think about it, why didn't they win? Why didn't God split the Mediterranean Sea? They were revolting for God, which in the first period means that God will take care of our enemies.
Right.
But in the new level of relationship and responsibility, God's answer is you want to revolt against Rome, you have to be grown up, you have to pick your shots, and certainly you can't afford on top of a revolt. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai said, instead of revolting, let's negotiate, live and let live. And even then, if you intend to revolt, there's certainly the world's greatest military power. You're not going to win by having a civil war, by the zealots killing those who oppose them. So in the second stage, the rabbis asked, in God's name, step up, take more responsibility. Your behavior will lead to make or break the future.
And then, okay, so if I hear that correctly, so stage 1, for lack of a better term, God is changing our diapers, right? We're little, God does everything for us. God tells us where to go, God takes us out of Egypt, God holds our hand. We're kind of like, we complain, we're stubborn, we're almost like children in the house.
Correct.
And there's some sort of transition, which you're saying starts even really before the temple. But the temple is an exclamation point on that, because this idea of depending on the temple for sacrifice and, we just pray and then God takes care of us and defends us doesn't work anymore. And so there's a transition towards a little bit more, it's on you. Again, the background here, we haven't used this word, is the idea of brit, the idea of there's a relationship between us and God.
It's a
and
dynamic partnership, and now you're growing up and taking on more responsibility.
Great. And then what brings us to the third era?
And I can't stress enough, because people get confused. God has become more hidden, not to distance from us, but to come closer.
Right.
And that is the key here. And when God was visible and dominant, naturally there's a dependency and leaving it all to God. Whereas when God is more hidden but more present, then God sustains me, but I take on more. Now, the third stage of arguing is God is totally hidden. Now, why do I say that? Because the truth is, when we study the medical statistics, we don't see that a blessing from the Rebbe ends up with more cures than the patient who didn't have a Rebbe's blessing. We don't see...
I'm laughing because I think almost daily something comes in my social media feed of, the son of the Dodgers went to the Rebbe's grave, and the statistics were 7-7-0 was the statistics in the game that they won the World Series.
Yeah, right.
So there's certainly people who believe that.
Correct.
And I think, and by the way, that I'm closer to that camp than you are. I think I'm definitely a card-holding believer. But your point that there's less scientific evidence for God's
That's just one
intervention.
example, and I'm going to put a bluntly, how about the Haredi version of Israel that I'm draft exempt because I'm studying Torah and God will protect us? I mean, if the Israelis took that literally, they'd all be dead now. I mean, the Arab armies would have wiped them out. So I think I'm speaking both the realism, but again, I want to stress it's the higher religious level. So why am I doing it? Not because God's going to zap the bad guys. I'm doing it because I love God, because I accept the relationship, because I love the vision of a perfected world. I love the fellow human beings who are going to benefit. So tonight, my judgment, it's a higher level of responsibility, but it's a higher level of achievement. And I'll give another example. The Holocaust, which, by the way, is what drove me into this whole development, because there was a point in my life when I was totally shattered by the Holocaust because I couldn't understand how God could let this happen. Particularly if you understood the covenant as we did in the first stage, it just, I couldn't reconcile it. So when looking at it, of course, came across and the understanding, the rabbis already began to teach us. Rabbis, for example, mentioned the destruction of the temple. How come God didn't stop it? And they answer, God is mighty, not like Moses described it, mighty smashing our enemies. God is mighty in the famous line, mighty because it controls his urge. He has this urge to wipe out the enemy, but he has a commitment to let the children grow to become mature adults. And so God gives humans freedom. And that freedom, the Romans used to wipe out the temple. That freedom, the total freedom that we're talking about today, that's the Nazis use that to exterminate the Jews, to kill millions of people.
And you would argue for positive as well. Positive things also have been used. The creation of the State of Israel, for example.
No, so the good news is that the Jewish people woke up after the Shoah and realized that powerlessness is unacceptable. That you're living in a world there's so much power available to evil that if you don't take up power, evil's going to win, and you'll be wiped out. And so, by the way, not just the Jews, women's liberation, African American liberation, anti-colonial liberation, gay liberation. How come they all happened after the Shoah? I believe because they all woke up and saw the same lesson, that evil has unlimited power available, and you have to take power. If you believe in life, if you believe in good, it's not going to happen otherwise. Now, if you do take it up, and this is an amazing accomplishment, the whole Jewish people, which was not Zionist before, I mean, the sad truth is the majority of Orthodox, like the majority of secular Jews. The Orthodox were afraid they would wait for the Messiah. The secular were afraid they'll say dual loyalty. The bottom line is the Zionists were a minority. But after this, the whole Jewish people woke up and realized that there's no alternative. If you believe in the mission, if you believe in the future, if you believe in that we have a right to live, then you have to be strong. Israel represents an incredible combination, taking up power, taking the strength. Therefore, you were able to guarantee a haven to any Jew who's in trouble, which you couldn't before. Therefore, you have an Israeli army that can defeat them. You know, people were shocked. I was shocked. We're all terribly troubled by October 7th. 1,200 people killed, the most in one day since the Holocaust. But you know something? It's not the Holocaust. The change is that unlike the Holocaust, because 1,200 a day, 1,000, 5,000 a day, for 6 years went on and on. No one stopped it. Here, the next day, Israel army went in and stopped it, defeated, killed those 1,000 fighters that were still in South Israel, killing people. So that's the point, and that created an army. Now again, tremendous cost. Nothing comes easy. But I want to point out that in the Holocaust too, if the humans had used the power that God asked them to, the Allies could have saved millions. In Denmark, they saved almost all their Jews. In Bulgaria, they saved almost all their Jews because they stood up for them, because they said, well, again, that's the point. And again, I want to stress that there are more miracles today than ever before in history. And God is responsible for those miracles, but those miracles are done exclusively, I would argue, through human agents and through the powers of natural law. Doctors, there's curing cancer. These are unbelievable achievements. What happened is the doctor studied the chemical, studied the biology, the biome, studied the immune system that God has implanted. and shows how to develop it to save life or to affirm life. So that's the real challenge of our time. And again, it's available in every field if we take responsibility.
So, Rabbi, let me ask a couple things. First is, I want to. There are, believe it or not, a couple things we disagree about. I think one of them I just want to add, like at least from where I'm sitting, like yes, there was one narrative that Haredi Jews sitting and learning Torah wouldn't help Israel in its wars. I guess there might be another narrative that I would share, which I would add, which is that only having an army without having anyone sitting and learning Torah in Israel, maybe we'd be less successful in our wars.
Absolutely.
And we could argue if that's for rational reasons or cosmic reasons.
No, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Because, again, when you use power, the question is, what are the limits? And one of the most important limits is to have a spiritual vision and a religious tradition that gives you ethics and it gives you limits and gives you a purpose. But having said that, it's not a substitute for it.
Right. Well, both of them are unbalanced right now, right? Having people that are excluding people who don't have access to the tradition, so it doesn't inform them, and people who are only learning it. That's why, we're proud to air Hesder yeshivas. We have, many people don't know that there are many Israelis who both serve in the army and study in yeshiva and really bring that together. But the second thing I wanted to ask you was, I really want to crystallize the difference between the second and the third era. Because I think one could argue that God is already hidden in the time of the temple's destruction, right? We don't have stories. I mean, I guess we have a few stories in the Talmud of God coming down and causing it to rain or that kind of thing. But for the most part, you could argue that God's already hidden then. So is it that the Holocaust is so traumatizing in its size and extremity that that's why it feels like it's a third era? What is the difference between those two different stages in your mind if you had to crystallize it?
Again, I don't have a clear, simple line, but I do feel God is hidden, but people feel much more conscious, much more available. I give an example of the synagogue. The temple, I mean, you had to go through a purification right before you could walk in the door. You felt there was a different world, and you literally almost felt you could touch God when you got there. The synagogue, it's downsized, it's lower voltage, and you do feel some specialness in this place. And it's many more places, much wider range of behavior. So I don't have a clear line, but in my judgment, we're living in a time when God is totally hidden in part, also culturally. The culture of the Middle Ages, the culture of the rabbinic period, nevertheless, much more into God's presence, much more into feeling all these other powers in the world, angels and all kinds of other forces. Our culture is almost filtered against those ideas.
Right.
So God in part is more deeply hidden because of the culture. But my point is, this is not necessarily a negative, because the hiddenness also paves the way for a greater spirit and for a greater depth of life. If I can give the example again, the exodus of the first temple of the first Beit HaMikdash, the great exodus from Egypt, God was visible. And when you see a sea splitting, you emotionally, and although you feel there is my God. Having said that, the exodus of Israel, of our time, 600,000 Jews left Egypt. 600,000 Jews survived the War of Independence. But then came 800,000 Arab Jews rescued, being expelled and being endangered, and they were rescued. 1.5 million plus Russian Jews, 150,000 Ethiopian Jews. So this exodus, actually, where humans do God's work, is greater in scope, greater in size. For that matter, think of so you're back to Holocaust is correct, but think that's what drove me in this direction. Couldn't understand why God didn't intervene in a more obvious sort of way. Having said that, the bottom line is, if you think of how degraded and how powerless we were in Auschwitz, and go from Auschwitz to the heights of Jerusalem, independent Israel, self-protective, it's a greater swing, in my judgment, than from Egypt's slavery to freedom in the land of Israel. So my point is, it's greater hiddenness, greater depth, but also greater human achievement, and therefore greater vision of God's presence in the world. And Isaiah said a long time ago, "You are my witnesses." What does it mean, you are my witnesses? We're living in a world where there's no audio-visual electric lights that say, "Here I am." So the hidden God can be brought out, can be discovered in a more powerful way, and it's the witnesses. In other words, the witnesses, you're trying to establish a fact. You can't prove the fact because the murder happened miles from here. What do? The witness testifies. So our behavior, our teaching, our behavior patterns, we testify. There is a God. We know that from the earliest days. There's a continuity. It's not that God has disappeared totally. The God who we felt and met and talked with every day in the first stage is the God who accompanied us and said, look, it's a more mature level. You won't see me in an obvious sort of way. Make a bracha and that'll help you feel my presence. Make a blessing. Say something or put on a ritual cloth that helps you feel this moment closer. Learn some Torah, very, very essential. By the way, the whole idea of learning Torah, that's one of the rabbi's major accomplishments in this direction. For two reasons. First of all, because when you study Torah, you're capable of understanding and applying what God wants of you with your own mind, because the Torah has enriched your thinking. Secondly, when you study Torah, that in itself brings a conscious, emotional connection to the God, and it reflects the shift to a greater and greater educational persuasive. God is not intimidating us. With all due respect to splitting the Red Sea or speaking from heaven, it is a little intimidating. And the Talmud itself makes the comment, when they stood at Sinai, it's a metaphor of poetry. God, you know why they accepted the Torah? God held the mountain over their head and said, if you accept my Torah, fine, if not, I'll bury you here. Well, of course, that's literally not true. The Jews in the Torah quoted in Exodus, we will listen, we will observe. But it's trying to say, when you have visible miracles, it is a little bit giving into superior force. And when God hides that completely, then you have to really go into it, believe it, bring it up. Then you have to be educated and raised and studied so that you will understand and commit. And this is a higher level when you get there. Until you get there, well, it's a problem. And there are people, as you pointed out before, there are people who take advantage of the God's hiddenness to say, there is no God, I'm God. But I think, we've learned this from our series of the last 2 centuries, that such people, they lose the sense of limit and accountability and leads to all kinds of terrible ongoing catastrophes. So that's our challenge, to recover the depth of God's presence in a much subtler and a much more mature way.
Beautiful. And I think something you've also alluded to during this process. First of all, I think what you're saying is great parenting or grandparenting advice. We should all keep that in track. Creating space for our beautiful flowers to flourish, let's say. But I wanted to add I think something that's inherent in what you're saying that I just wanted to pull out is the idea of incrementalism, right? So, you mentioned, I think in part 1 of this interview, the idea of Judaism kind of sending us in a direction, right? So it doesn't come along and say, end slavery during biblical times, because we're not ready for that yet. The idea is, let's push you in a direction of acting more sensitively towards slaves, with the goal that over time there will be no more slavery. The second example you gave was the idea of how we think about food. So we're going to be permitted to eat animals initially, but over time, the goal, what we're trying to get, is such sensitivity to animal life that we're switching to plant life, right? So that's, I guess when I ask you about that, first of all, I think it's a super important point to pull out, but I want to ask you, how do you, what's the way to think about this? I want you to, I guess, expand on incrementalism for a second, which is like, why is it incrementalism? Right? Why don't we have Exodus was like a big swooping, we had 10 Makot, these big, plagues, and everything changed. Like, why the idea of slowly one step forward?
So again, I struggle with it all the time too. I'm not comfortable with the Torah accepted slavery, but you come to realize it's respect for humanity. When you try to change overnight, you get backlash. I mentioned the Civil War, a catastrophe.
Right.
And what's more, because it didn't happen incrementally, Jim Crow came after the Civil War, and there's still to this day, 150 years later, serious racism because it didn't grow. And the point of incrementalism is, you change the psychology, you change the culture, you change the attitude, and so people accept it. And when you force people, you get a lot of backlash and a lot of counterproductive and a lot of destructive. Again, I mentioned the so-called liberation movements that ended up imposing freedom. Of course, they didn't impose freedom, it ended up imposing slavery again. And you began to torture the dissidents, put them in concentration camps, killed by the millions, as Mao Zedong did and Stalin did. So it's painful, and it's painful, literally, because if you do it step by step, people are enslaved for a longer period. Well, again, let me not stop just with these obvious cases. How about women's condition? When Torah was given, women were bought and sold. They were chattels. They were bought and sold. That was their status. Now, the Torah's first step, by the way, is it abolishes commercial selling of women. It says only a parent can sell a child, and only to somebody who promised to marry them, and marry them once they're married, they have equal rights as a free woman, and if they don't marry them, they go free. Now again, it's far from what we're talking about, and in my judgment, we still haven't gotten to the full dignity, full equality. Well, how about gay liberation? Same issues. The Torah opposes forms of homosexuality that are exploitive, that are based on power, that are based on anti-family. But we, in the course of development, have seen, in our lifetime particularly, homosexuality is not a perverse choice. In most cases, it is a hormonal genetic reality, which they have a natural proclivity for same sex. Secondly, we see in our lifetime that they are willing, want to be judged and live by the same standards as heterosexual. Marriage, family, monogamy, relationship. So again, my answer is the tradition is not, it's not a fossil. It's not a frozen. It has the capacity to grow, and the best way to grow is incremental, because when it's incremental, it's natural, it doesn't violate all your emotional associations and all your past experiences, and therefore it is much more likely to lead to a full identification and joining in, or at least not a kind of violent rejection. But we've seen all over the world when things are pushed too far and too fast.
Beautiful. So two things I want to pull out of that. One is, again, this reminder to me as a parent, and God willing one day as a grandparent, this idea of, what it means to take people along, like slowly, to plant the seeds and let things happen. There's a phrase you use in your leadership, you can only lead by what percentage? What do you say again?
Yeah. Well, I say 5 to 10% is the limit of what you can try for, and if you're lucky, you'll get 1 or 2% movement. If you go to 15 or 20% ahead of them, they turn you off. They think you're a stranger. They think you're a different person.
Right. So a slight shift, right? Move the boat a couple inches, and you end up in a different location. And this idea of this metaphor you're describing of you're with them in the beginning. As they get older, you're moving back, and at a certain point, you're saying, "I am as closest to you as I've ever been, even though I'm not at all trying to shape or intervene in your life. I'm holding your hand through your pain."
Intervening, but I'm not. It's not coercive and it's not authoritarian. It's based on partnership and joint commitment. And again, honestly, when your kids did it because you gave them a patch or because they wanted you to take them to the ball game and the movies, they did it. But they do it as consistently and as high quality and as fully committed as when they grew up and they got it from you and they really understand what you stand for and they want to be like you. And yes, it's a very important analogy for parenting in general, to learn, and love in general, to learn when self-limiting to make room for the other, self-limiting to encourage initiative and autonomy and strength in the other. And that again is the Torah is trying to say it's a balance. It's not, the obvious answer is, if I have no authority, if my parents can't tell me anything, I do it all myself. There are sometimes you can do things that your parents wouldn't let you do, but on the other hand, there is the loss of relationship, the loss of continuity, the loss of good models in the past. So I think Judaism is trying to make this ideal balance of models from the past, of respect for tradition, and it's important too, because the danger our side in our lifetime is you can't say the kid did something wrong. You can tell them only how good they are. You can't tell them wrong. But Judaism wants to have its cake and eat it. It says, no, there's a time you do say you did wrong. They'll survive. They'll thrive. They'll become more responsible. They'll become more mature. But it's a balance, and as they get older and stronger and more capable, then the parent shrinks in a positive way. Less demanding, less simply dictating, and more encouraging, respecting, rewarding in emotional sense.
So a couple of things that you're bringing up for me again. One is, I guess I want to balance out this idea of incrementalism, this idea of humans taking control with the concept of what I'll call bitachon, the idea of trusting in God. Because I think, like you've said before about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, you have to have every character trait, quality, and its opposite. I think, I also see, and I do myself, and I've struggled with this, I've been working on bitachon, trust in God. It's like a core thing I've been working on for a few years now. This idea that you can, if you become so focused in the idea that it's in the hands of humans, and it's grandpa's not telling me what to do anymore, then at a certain point you're running around like a headless chicken, doing so much and going so extra that you're not creating space to have let's call it our quiet partner in the race. So I want to just name that. And the second thing I wanted to name, just in terms of your question, what you raised earlier around how we think about homosexual relationships or LGBTQI or that kind of space. I think for me that was one of the big misses, I think, and continues to be a miss within traditional Judaism, which is kind of the focus on the nature of someone's sexuality and their relationships, and kind of putting on the shelf the idea of brit, the idea of covenant, the idea of saying either as soon as you cross a certain line, you're not in the camp, instead of saying, is there a way, as you pointed out in part one of this interview, this pro-life, maximizing life, the idea of brit, the idea of being in a relationship, the idea of having a covenantal relationship within our marriage. Is there some way to think about how to do that within traditional Judaism, as maybe not exactly the same as, Kiddushin and Nisuin, I would say, but like traditional Jewish marriage, but as some angle in that creates a space that really is more about reflecting the larger value, because that you never see that conversation in beyond Judaism in the right and the left, right? You have people on the right saying I don't care about pronouns, I don't care, but instead of saying okay, can we get into a world of pronouns and transgender and those types of questions, and can we at the same time say that family is important, that marriage is important? And not saying that everyone should agree with that, but that to me feels like a conversation that's not happening, where you could really, and that's where it should be happening. Does that make sense?
Thank you for saying this. I couldn't agree with you more. And keep in mind, again, I say it's a false binary here that we're being pushed to do. And again, I am highly sympathetic to where the Torah objects to homosexuals. Look at Achilles in the Iliad. He's clearly capable of having heterosexual, because he has a wife and a family at home. But instead, he chooses to go to war because he likes to hang out with the boys, and he likes to fight wars. And he likes to have Patroclus, his sex toy, with him. It's not based on love, it's based on he's the domineering figure, and he uses this guy in his pleasure. And so again, to be fair, homosexuality in their culture, they say, but it's your fault because you marginalized me. But for a long time it was based on, it still is in some, promiscuity, no commitments, no relationship, and no family. But what I'm saying is we have to be alert and aware. In our time, we discovered the legitimate basis of a natural proclivity, not because I am bored or I'm not interested in my wife, but because this is a genuine reaction that's built into the person's very physical nature, and we have to respect that. And after all, the same Torah also said it's not good for a human being to be alone. So God has given this quality, and secondly, they, understanding this, have now turned to us and said, I'm ready to accept the other standards. Relationship, not power, not casual.
Right.
Faithfulness, monogamy, not promiscuity. Family, I want to have children. It seems to me they're asking to be judged by the same standard. And my answer is, they should be given the same judgment, meaning if they do the right kind, then it's respected. If they do the wrong kind, it's wrong. But I would say the same for heterosexual. And the tradition in this case, and I understand those who are trying to protect it, But the danger is the tradition is not a tradition for the sake of tradition. It has real strong values. The values are family, faithfulness, relationship. Those are strong values. But then don't misunderstand that with the particular detail of whether this family or this commitment relationship is between a man and a woman or a man and a man. It's possible. And it's easier, it's more standard, a man and a woman. I don't want to make light of that. It's still the vast majority. But there is a minority based not on perversion, but on actual physical causes. And we're not dishonor the tradition by recognizing that difference. The more we recognize the uniqueness of individuals, the more I think we are fulfilling the divine vision of a fully human, living a fully human life. And in this minority's case, it lives it in a somewhat different fashion, but they're willing to live in the same spiritual, ethical regimen. Well, it seems to me that's the way we should be thinking and going.
Okay, beautiful. A couple more questions. We're running out of time, so I'm going to try to squeeze it in. We'll see. I'm trying to think which one. I'll pick one because I want to be respectful of our time. You've been spending significant time in Israel, I think really since COVID. You were there a lot before that, but kind of COVID, the way things worked out, you kind of ended up staying full-time in Israel. I just, you've developed this theology, your approach to the world, mostly here with spending a lot of time there. What has been the impact for you in Blue of living in Israel, becoming Israeli citizens? Kind of how has that shaped your worldview, if any, both before and since October 7th?
Yeah, well, again, on the one hand, I realized more and more, and not least after October 7th, that the choice to live in Israel or to make Aliyah, it's a very heroic choice. I want to stress that in general. It's heroic because that's what the parents are saying now, and that's what the young people are saying now after October 7th. I understand that if I want to be a Jew and live in Israel, that I have to take the risk of binding my child like Abraham. Emil Fagenem has this fantastic line in modern Jewish thought that every Jewish parent in our time after the Shoah shows as much spiritual courage and bravery as Abraham. The peak of his life was that he was willing to bind his child. Only in the Shoah, for 1.5 million children, there was no ram to substitute. So every Jewish parent, everybody who chooses to be Jewish, that's the opening lines of the book, by the way.
Wow.
I say every Jew today is a Jew by choice. Because, it's estimated 25,000 French Jews took the other tack after World War II. They bought false papers, they went to places they wouldn't know them so they could hide to being Jewish. But the vast majority of Jews went the other way. They not only didn't run away, they came closer, they stood up, they were counted. And now we see after October 7th that counting includes risking your children's life, and the children are proving to us by volunteering, by insisting on taking responsibility. So that is much more deeper than I thought. I mean, in the first day of October 7th, our granddaughter, our daughter's fourth child, youngest girl, lost her lover, her love. They were about to get engaged. He was killed in the first day of fighting. It's devastating. It's devastating. It's not over, obviously. One of our daughter's sons was badly wounded in Gaza. So again, you can't, thank God, with miracles of medicine, they saved his life and they believe they will eventually be able to restore full use of his legs. But he had infection and sickness, and it's more than a year and it's still going on, all these challenges of trying to recover physically. So the most powerful impact of Israel was the realization that Jewish fate is so elemental and so dangerous. Secondly, I can't stress enough, this is the heroic age of the Jewish people. They, far from running away, they have stepped up and stepped forward, and not just in Israel, in diaspora. That's the most powerful thing. Now again, including the most powerful thing, visiting those shivas. Our last week, 2 weeks ago, before we left for America, Ben, our son Moshe's, Ben, he's the number 6 child, he's the second boy. His teacher, one of his teachers, was killed in action. And he and his older brother, they said to me they have attended so many shivas They attended more shivas in the last year than I attended my whole lifetime. And it's very painful. It's very risky. But again, I keep stressing, and the young people, overwhelmingly the response is to volunteer, and they're volunteering not just that they want to go to the army, they volunteer for Kravi, for fighting units. They understand the risk, they understand the cost. So number one is Israel has certainly made much more conscious both of the bravery of the Jewish people, the heroism, and what an amazing statement we're getting of our generation in America and in Israel of stepping up to take responsibility. And I keep stressing that after the greatest destruction, the greatest outburst of death in our history, we've had the greatest outburst of life. There's more Torah being taught and learned today than ever before in Jewish history, even though the Nazis killed 30% of the Jews, 80% of the scholars were dead by 1945. So this is the greatest, and that's to me the great theme of Judaism. You respond to death by having children. You respond to death by building a new society, a society of justice and of chesed and of loving kindness. And that has been the strongest. It's happening in America too, not just in Israel. And I believe in America all over the world. The Jewish community has shown now, when the media turned against Israel, when so many bystanders have tried to, anti-Semitism, to deny Israel's right to exist, more people have stepped forward, not less. And the people who were for Israel before have intensified their support and strength. So I think if one should celebrate Jewish life, I was telling in my book, Jewish life again, I think when people look back 1,000 years from now, they will say, this is a generation that showed really the incredible power of Jews. Faith, to walk with God into a desert, to walk with God into an unsown land. It's even greater to walk into God into a contested country which the enemies are trying to wipe you out, and the neighbors. To walk with God toward this final redemption, not to give up and not to back away, and not to say it's hopeless. And again, I'm not trying to deny some people have left Israel, but to me, the big story is the vast majority stepping up and saying, Hineni, I'm here, I'm willing to take on this responsibility. And the best way of showing responsibility, again, is not just the fighting, it's the building of the life, the building of a more just society, the building of a model, and that's what the Jewish people is doing now for the whole world. So if we have a temporary period, I believe it will be temporary, where Israel, Zionism is turned into a toxic phrase, where enemies lie freely and swear and use terms, genocide, that deny Israel's legitimacy. I don't deny that that's there, but I still believe we persist, we were strong, and people will then balance. People will look back and say, the radical left is a sign not of Israel's flaws, but of the left's failure to understand reality. You know, after World War I, student bodies and the left turned pacifist because there was so much death in the World War I. So Churchill was a warmonger, they said. They said it literally at Oxford Union. And then they, taking this line, Hitler was appeased instead of being stopped. So of course a greater catastrophe came. Now I believe the same could have happened here, but Israel is not that way, and I hope and I believe they will win through eventually. So this is, you, me, everybody alive today has this chance to make this contribution, to be the generation that steps up and takes responsibility.
Rabbi Yitz, thank you so much. This has really been such an honor. In this eternal path towards the triumph of life, I thank my lucky stars. I thank Hashem that I get to be in the path at the same time as you, and to get to spend some time with you and Blue and with my wife Tali and our families. And thank you for everything you've shared with our audience today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.